Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I want to talk through 5 objections that often come up when you begin to explore your story. When I was first invited to take a look at my story, I got stuck because these objections kept coming up for me. It's very common to make movement toward exploring your story in more depth, only to be quickly sidelined by internal objections to the whole endeavor. So what I'm going to do is first I will say what they are, and then we'll unpack each one. Objection number 1. I should focus on the present and the future, not dwell on the past. Dwell on the past. That's number 1. Number 2, second objection. Looking at my story is basically self-indulgent, introspective navel gazing, and I'm called to focus on God and others, not focus on myself. Okay, objection 3. Who am I to judge my parents? Jesus says, do not judge. Besides, I don't want to blame my parents. Who am I to judge / blame my parents? That's objection 3. Number 4. If you overcome number 3, number 4 often comes up, and it's this. There's no point in looking at how my parents have harmed me because they did the best they could. They did the best they could. So there's no point in looking at how they've harmed me. And the 5th objection that came up for me and that I've experienced with a lot of people doing story work is simply this. I can't change what's already happened. I can't change the past. So what's the point of looking at it? Okay, those are the 5 objections. Let's take them one by one. Number 1, I should focus on the present and the future, not dwell on the past. Look, if you have been raised in the church, it is common to have this nagging sense that you're not supposed to, quote unquote, dwell on the past. The idea is that if you spend too much time thinking about the past, you will somehow get stuck there. It will weigh you down. If you think about the past, the thinking goes, the idea is, it will do more harm than good. It won't be helpful to you. Indeed, just that phrase, dwell on the past, it's become pejorative in most Christian circles. It's just pejorative in our culture, that phrase, dwell on the past. Nobody uses the phrase in a positive way. I mean, imagine recounting your day to a friend and saying, I'm really proud of myself. I spent an hour today dwelling on my past. But look, does God really want you to ignore your past story? I don't think so. I don't think so. And one of the reasons I'm convinced that God deeply values engaging your past is because the Bible devotes a great deal of space to doing just that. In other words, the Bible tells stories about things that have happened in the past. It tells lots and lots of stories. 70% of the biblical text is narrative. In other words, 70% of the biblical text is devoted to telling stories about the past. Why would such a sizable portion of Scripture focus on recounting the past if God doesn't value deeply honoring what has been true about what actually happened in the past? So let's just take one of my favorite passages on this subject, which is in Philippians 3. And Paul says the following, and it has often been brought up to me by others to say, hey, Adam, we really shouldn't look at the past. And here's what Paul says: forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. There it is. I mean, he couldn't be more clear. Forgetting what is behind, straining towards what is ahead. I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Okay, that's Paul. Philippians 3. Now, if you take this verse out of context, okay, Paul seems to be very clearly saying that Christians should forget the past and focus on the future. However, just a few verses earlier, Paul says this. Listen to this. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. That's Philippians 3, verses 10 and 11. Now, what's Paul saying? His point is that you cannot experience resurrection, i.e., healing, maturation, growth, until you know something of the fellowship of sharing in Christ's sufferings, until you know something of the death of Christ. Do you remember that phrase? Becoming like him in his death. If you read all of Philippians 3, you will see that Paul is not saying that we should forget the past. Far from it. On the contrary, what Paul is calling us to do is to experientially know something of the suffering and the death of Christ. But, okay, great. But what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean to become like Christ in his death? Well, look, each one of you have experienced something of the suffering and the death of Christ in your story on this earth. You have, what do I mean? You have known humiliation like Christ. You have been the object of another person's contempt, just like Christ. You have experienced something of powerlessness during your time here on earth, just like Christ. What would it look like to follow Paul in wanting to know these sufferings, your sufferings, more fully? So much so that you become like Christ in his death, i.e., in the death of the sufferings that you have experienced so far on earth. What if knowing your sufferings more fully requires that you, quote unquote, dwell on the past? In other words, what if knowing your sufferings more fully and becoming like Christ in his death requires that you ponder, reflect on, engage, explore your past story of deaths, of woundings, of harm? So, in summary, objection number one, I think the Bible takes the past very seriously, and so should we. So it's quite godly, in my opinion, to spend some time reflecting on your past story. Okay, objection two. Looking at my story is just self-indulgent, introspective, self-centered navel gazing. And God calls me to focus on others and on God, not to focus on Adam, not to focus on me. Now, look, that objection, it sounds so biblical. It sounds so right. Self-centeredness is not a Christian virtue. Several years ago, I heard a sermon. I was sitting in the sanctuary in which the pastor said the following. He said, look, some of you are way too focused on your story. Excessive introspection is simply another form of self-centeredness, he said. Why not try thinking less about the bad things that have happened to you and think more about how you can love other people? That was his exhortation. And again, look, it sounds quite biblical. But what I would like to suggest and to shout as loudly as I can from the rooftops is that that quote unquote exhortation is actually diabolical. And what I mean by that is of the kingdom of evil, diabolos. Now, why? Why? Well, look, one reason is just neuroscience. Neuroscience research has shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that the people who spend time reflecting on their past and who know their story, those people have an increased ability to empathize with others. The portions of the brain that are devoted to empathy are more activated in the kinds of people that have spent time reflecting on their past and getting clear about their own story. So those people not only empathize more with others, but they exhibit more caring behaviors towards others. That's number one. So to put it in a more succinct way, the neuroscience research has demonstrated that exploring your past story increases your capacity to love other people well. It makes it more likely that you're going to be a loving, caring human being. Understanding your story. I've tried to emphasize this, but perhaps I haven't done it enough. Understanding your story is not an end in itself. All right, that's not the goal. Why? Because deep down, we all intuitively know that we are made for more than healing. The goal is not healing. Healing is beautiful, and there is more. The ultimate purpose of engaging your story. Why am I inviting you to do this? What is the ultimate purpose? The purpose is to discover who you are and what you are meant to do in service of others during your time here on this earth. Said another way, the purpose of engaging your story is to discover your kingdom. Your kingdom. Now, what do I mean by your kingdom? Well, in Luke 22, Jesus says to his disciples, and by extension to you and me, I have conferred on you a kingdom. What is Jesus getting at? You have a kingdom, and it is the terrain, the domain over which you rule. That's your kingdom. Your kingdom includes all the people that you impact by the unique ways that you love, the unique ways that you reflect the image of God. And no one reflects the image of God like you do. Nobody. Because you are a unique imago Dei, image of God. And that is really worth pondering. There is a way that you bring your presence to this world that reflects God that no one else does, not in quite the way you do it. So your kingdom includes all the ways that you bring beauty, goodness, honor to your corner of the world. Your kingdom is different than my kingdom. And this is, and please hear the next phrase. That sentence is true, not primarily because we have different giftings, though we do. It is true because we have different stories. Your kingdom is different than mine, not primarily because we have different gifting, but because we have different stories. In other words, if you want to identify the particularities of the kingdom that Jesus has conferred on you, you have to understand where you came from. You have to understand how you got here. You have to understand your past story. It is important to understand, and this is where the whole reality of living in a world at war, the reality of the kingdom of evil comes into play here. It is important to understand that the harm that you have experienced in your past is not random. Okay, it didn't happen by chance. There is a force in the world that does not mean you well. I call it the kingdom of evil. It is against the goodness and the honor and the beauty and the delight of God. Now, this entity, this force, evil, has assaulted you precisely in the areas that you most reflect the beauty and glory of God. So, for example, what do I mean? Example, if you were exquisitely sensitive as a young girl, it is likely that your sensitivity has been cursed and shamed time and time again. If you were, different example, particularly imaginative as a little girl and open to just a sense of wonder, it is likely that those attributes have been assaulted over the course of your life. Here's the point. Identify how you have been harmed, and you will be a step closer to knowing something specific about your kingdom and about your name and about the presence and that you bring to the world. You're familiar, I imagine, with the Joseph story that concludes the book of Genesis, and the culmination of the Joseph story in many ways is Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. Now, that sentence, what you intended for evil, God meant for good, That is intended to be a banner over each person's story, including yours. To look at your story is to identify how God took the wounds that evil inflicted and used those very wounds to equip you to rule over your kingdom and to become more of the person that you were created to be. Here's the point. Reflecting on your stories of harm and heartache is precisely what is required to know something about what you are called to do in this world. So let's remember why I'm on this rant, because of the objection, the second objection. Instead of it being introspective navel gazing, looking at your story will make you a more loving, empathetic person, number one, and number two, knowing where you have come from, which includes the ways you've been wounded, is part of what it means to be a deep follower of Christ who has been equipped and is being equipped to rule over a kingdom. And the nature of a kingdom is that it is in service to others. Okay, that's objection 2. Objection 3. Who am I to judge my parents? Who am I to judge? Now, many Christians begin engaging their story, but their good endeavor comes to a screeching halt with the objection, it's not my place to judge my parents. I just shouldn't be doing this. It's not right. It's not my place. And the objection kind of goes like this. Jesus says not to judge people. So who am I to judge my parents' actions towards me? I don't know their full story. I don't know why they did what they did to me. It's God's job to judge my parents. It's not my job. Now, again, this objection, it sounds so biblical at first glance, but it's not. It's not. When most people say, I'm not supposed to judge my parents, they are appealing to Jesus's teaching in Matthew 7, which begins, do not judge, or you too will be judged. But Jesus, as he often does, continues talking. And in the continuation of his words, he sheds light on what he may have meant with his opening remarks, do not judge, or you too will be judged. So a close reading, if you keep reading Matthew 7, you will see that Jesus is actually calling you, me, every follower of his to judge. To judge well, accurately, to judge in love, but to judge. Here's what Jesus, let me read it. Here's what Jesus says, Matthew 7, it's the first 5 verses. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Now here's verse 5. You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now notice something. What is the trajectory of Jesus' teaching, which begins with do not judge? What's Jesus's point? Where's he going? What's his main argument? Jesus's point is that he wants us to become the kind of men and women who see clearly enough. We got the plank out of our eye, so we can see clearly enough to do what? To do what? To remove the speck from another person's eye. In other words, the whole point of this teaching that begins with those 3 words, do not judge, is that you and I are absolutely called to judge other people and to judge them well. Think about it. How can you remove the speck from another person's eye if you have not first judged that person as having a speck in their eye? And what's a speck? It's a metaphor for something in the other person's heart that is sinful or harmful. How can you remove the sinful speck from another person's eye if you have not first named, judged, and identified what that speck is? As you explore your story, you will inevitably encounter moments when your parents harmed you because your parents are sinners just like you. According to Matthew 7, your task is to help remove the speck from their eye. And you cannot remove the speck from your dad's eye until you have first identified the speck, i.e., named your dad's sin. And that requires judgment. So the whole point of Jesus's teaching here is that we are to be the kind of people who love others actively enough that we are willing to reach into their eye, getting right up in their personal space, and gently remove the speck that is hurting them and others. In fact, in the conclusion of this teaching in Matthew 7, Jesus says this, and it's an enigmatic verse, but it's very important to understanding his teaching. He says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs." Now, what is the sacred pearl that Jesus is referring to? It is precisely, look at it in context, it is precisely your willingness to name the other person's speck, your willingness to gently point out the other person's sin. When you say to your mother, "Mom, here are some of the ways that you harmed me growing up. This is what it was like having you as a mom," you are giving her a pearl. This is part of how we love one another well. So if Jesus calls us to judge, give a pearl, which requires judgment, why does he begin with "do not judge"? Why does he start out saying that? Oh, Jesus, why do you do stuff like this? Well, look, when Jesus says "do not judge," he's using the word judge to refer to a posture of condemning the other person. The word for judge is based on the Greek word root krino. And this root is also used in Romans 8, verse 1, where Paul writes, "There is no condemnation against those who are in Christ Jesus." Now, it's the verb kata krino. Kata meaning against, krino meaning judgment. So kata krino is judgment against, condemnation. Jesus is warning us against that, against condemning another human being, whether it's your mother, your father, or anyone else. Jesus is not warning us against judging another human being. Condemning another person is very different from naming their sin and identifying their speck. Here's the point. Jesus is not warning you about judgment per se, but judgment against. Okay? Condemnation has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus. A spirit of condemnation is very different from a posture of, "I love you enough that I am willing to tell you how I've experienced you, Mom, how I've experienced you, Dad, and how you have harmed me. And I feel pain still as a 30-year-old, as a 40-year-old from our growing up years." That is not a posture of condemnation. That is a posture of being willing to love someone enough that you tell them the truth. It is very common to begin taking a peek at some of the ways that your parents harmed you, wounded you, only to be met with this internal feeling of, "I don't want to be one of those people that blames my parents for everything." Now, look, first of all, I'm not inviting you to blame your parents for everything. Your parents are not responsible for all of your wounds. But number two, there is a difference between blaming and naming. Blame is having a posture of contempt towards another person. Blame is a pointed finger that seeks to expose someone so that you can condemn them. That's what blame is. There is a big difference between blaming your father and naming what has been true about your relationship with your father. There's a big difference between a posture of condemning your mother and wanting to have a candid conversation with her about how she has harmed you. I have two adolescent children, and 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whenever it is, the day is coming. Okay. The day is coming when they are going to sit me down and say some version of the following: Dad, here's what it was like to have you as a father. Here's what it was like to be parented by an ambivalently attached man who was often dysregulated in our house. Let me tell you, Dad, what that was like for me. Let me tell you some of the ways that you wounded me. Now, when my son or daughter comes to me and says that, truly, it will be one of the holiest moments of my life. They're not blaming me. They're giving me the opportunity to participate in their healing by owning some of the ways that I've harmed them and seeking to repair the damage that I've done. I want my children, I am a father, I want my children to feel the freedom to tell me how I have wounded them. So, objection 3, who am I to judge my parents? My answer to that is, you're a follower of Jesus, and Jesus judged people all the time. That's who you are. Objection 4, there's no point at looking at how my parents hurt me because they did the best that they could. Hundreds of people have sat in my office and they have said some version of this sentence: Adam, I'll admit that my parents harmed me, but they did the best they could. Now, this is an odd objection for Christians to make, less so for if you don't identify as a Christian. But for Christians, this is just a strange, frankly, it's intellectually dishonest to have this objection. Why? Because why? Because according to the Bible, no one does the best they can all the time. Nobody does. Everyone's a sinner. What does that mean? It means that sometimes we do our best and sometimes we don't do our best. But no one tries their best all the time. No parent makes it from the kid's age of 0 to 18 doing their best all the time. As a high schooler, as a college student, I loved the Sermon on the Mount. It was just one of those passages that was, my pet. I loved it. I loved it. Until I'm a 30-something-year-old man and Dan Allender ruined the Sermon on the Mount for me. How do you ruin it? Well, Dan pointed out that in Matthew 5, Jesus talks about lust and anger. I was familiar with said passage in Matthew 5. Dan went on to say that Jesus's point is that everyone is an adulterer, everyone lusts, and everyone is a murderer. Everyone has contempt, everyone rages. And then the mic drop was when Dan had the audacity to suggest that word everyone included my mother and father. And I remember where I was sitting. Look, I knew that I had adulterous lust in my heart. I knew that I had murderous rage in my heart, but I wasn't so sure that my parents did. In fact, I was sure that they didn't. I could not have written down on a 3x5 card any bullets about how my father or mother had lusted or raged. So I was missing one of the primary points of this Sermon on the Mount that I claimed to love so much. And I wasn't missing it with regard to my own heart. I was just missing it with regard to my parents' hearts. But the claim of the Bible, and it's not just in the Sermon on the Mount, is that all people, including your parents, are sinful. And this means that there were times when your father didn't do the best that he could. There were times when your mother did not do her best. We hide behind that phrase, my parents did their best. Why? Because we don't want to look at the reality of the sin in their hearts. And more importantly, we don't want to look at how deeply they hurt us. But if everyone is a sinner, have you named the ways that your mother sinned against you? That your father sinned against you? That's part of what it means to explore your story. Okay, we made it. We're almost done. Last objection for today. Number 5. I cannot change what's already happened. I can't change the past. So what's the point of looking at it, Adam? Um, if you've listened to this podcast very much, you know that I'm very fond of two short sentences from William Faulkner's novel, Requiem for a Nun, and they are oh so appropriate at this juncture. So I'm just going to say it again. What does Faulkner write? The past is never dead. It's not even past. I love that. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Now, that's just great writing. Look, if you think your past is in the past, you just don't understand how the brain functions. Whenever you have an experience in the present, this afternoon, later tonight, the first thing your brain does, this is how brains operate, this is what neurons do, is it filters that present experience through all your past experiences. In other words, no one experiences the reality of the present moment as it truly is. That you can't, because you have neurons, and that's not how neurons operate. You experience reality through the lens of what you have already experienced. In other words, you see more of what you've already seen. Why? Because you have neurons. And that's how neurons operate. Neurons are connected one to another, or often one to 10,000 others. And neurons that are connected together, the phrase is that are wired together. When neurons are wired together, they fire together. Neurons that are wired together fire together. In other words, neurons that are closely connected to each other, wired together, tend to fire together again and again and again. What does this mean? Look, so much neurobiology. Let me make it super practical. When I was a boy, my mother looked to me for emotional connection, comfort, companionship. My dad was emotionally checked out with full-blown PTSD from the Vietnam War. He was not attuned to my mother. And my mom responded to this heartache by training me as a young boy to become very, very attuned to her and to care for her. And in time, I knew I was required to be very attentive to my mom's needs and to meet those needs as best I could as a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 7-year-old. So I became hyper attuned to my mom's emotional states. I knew when she needed me to tend to her, to talk with her about her troubles, things that my father should have been doing. I knew my brain, my neurons learned that when my mother is upset, it is my job to make her feel better. That's what my neurons learned. They fired together over and over. Mom's upset, go tend to her. Now, here's the point. Here's the point. Decades later, my mom's been dead for 2 decades. Decades later, when a woman is upset, I feel like it's my job to tend to her and comfort her and make her world okay again. Now, not everyone feels that way. I do. Why? Because I have neurons. And that's how neurons operate. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So the neurons that tell me a woman is upset, I'm looking at a woman crying, those are connected to the neurons in my brain that say, Adam, spring into action and go comfort that woman. Make her world better. My brain, the neuroscience word for it, has been primed. That's the word. My brain, just like your brain, just like all brains, my brain has been primed to think when a woman is upset, it's my job to make her feel better. The reason that the past isn't dead, the reason that it's not even past is because of this thing called priming. God has designed the brain with neurons so that it anticipates, so that your brain anticipates the next thing based on past experiences. So let me turn this objection on its head. The point of exploring your story, your past, is so that you can increasingly actually live in the real present. All right, that's very important to understand. Until you engage your past story, until you make some sense of what went down for you, You are actually living as much in the past as you are in the present. In other words, your brain is filtering your present experiences through the lens of unmetabolized wounds from your growing up years. And that's just how neural networks operate. But as you become clear about your wounds, and as you address them, and as you name them, and as you feel your feelings about them, the filters begin to fade, and you are able to live increasingly in the actual present. So now, when a woman is upset, the priming function that says, Adam, go take care of her, it's far less strong than it was 2 decades ago, far less. Why? Because I've engaged my past at some level, which allows me to live in the present. Thank you, William Faulkner. Dan Allender is fond of saying, and rather provocatively saying, few things are easier to change than your past. Look, what's he mean? His point is that the way you have made sense of your past is very likely wrong. Why? Because there are many family truths that a child's brain can't bear. So, for example, as a 7-year-old, your brain cannot let in the reality that your father preferred your older sister to you. A 7-year-old can't let that in. A 10-year-old brain cannot let in the reality that your mother preferred your older brother to you. It can't bear that, so it can't see it. A 13-year-old brain cannot let in the reality that your stepfather was molesting you on a regular basis. So in short, a child or an adolescent brain cannot let in the reality of harm from the two people who are supposed to protect you and delight in you. And as a result, your brain's only option is to form a deeply flawed, inaccurate narrative of your past. My flawed narrative was this: God gave me a kind and loving mother to compensate for a physically and emotionally abusive father. That was the narrative I had. And it was deeply flawed. It was inaccurate because I couldn't bear to see the truth. How do you change your past? Is Dan right? There's nothing easier to change than your past. If that's right, how do you change it? By becoming clear about the truth of your story. The narrative reveals the truth that was always there, but that could not be seen by a child's eyes. It took me years to rewrite my narrative from God gave me a kind and loving mother to compensate for my abusive father to transfer that to the truth, which was my mother trained me to be her surrogate spouse, which set me up to be envied and hated by my father. So it's not just that my narrative was wrong. It was like the opposite of what was true. And that's not uncommon. When you accurately name the truth of your story, your brain changes. And as neurons rewire, they are able to be more inclined to see the present more truthfully, accurately, clearly. Let me close with this. The claim of the gospel, even if you don't think Dan's right with his few things are easier to change than your past, the claim of the gospel is that you can absolutely change the past. I mean, you can't change the events. You can't make the wounds not happen, but you can receive healing. And what does healing mean neurobiologically? It means that your brain is different. It means that neurons that were not formerly connected link up with each other, integrate, and are now connected. The way your brain remembers the event, in other words, can absolutely change. When God heals, neurons rewire. What the resurrection means in neurobiological terms is the rewiring of the cells that make up your brain. So that's why I love Dan's sentence. Few things are easier to change than your past. Okay, that was quite a ride. 5 objections. I hope that these have a little bit less sticking power. in your heart and mind, and so that you are freed up to continue to explore your story in more depth. Thank you so much for listening.